Okay, I'm going to start. I've sent it to you, Diane. What I'm going to do
Thank
first
you.
is I'm going to review the last two sessions that we've had. We started off, three weeks ago, actually, looking at Maimonides' notion of Tamuna, and we read along with that a Torah portion that involved Moses, Aaron, and Miriam, where in this Torah portion, if you might remember it, God is upset with Aaron and Miriam because they were aspiring to have the same stature as Moses with respect to him. And he mentions in that particular passage, God does, that Moses is able to view or gaze at his Tamuna, and Miriam and Aaron are not. Now, Maimonides takes great pains to set in the Guide for the Perplexed to separate the Tamuna from the Tselem and from other images of God. And the translation of Tamuna, as Leo Strauss and Shlomo Pinas make, is that Tamuna is figure, is the word figure. Now, I'm stressing this because I would say that one of the central aspects of the thing that we're driving at is we want to be able to understand or get a glimpse at this Tamuna. Now, Moses got a glimpse at this Tamuna, and maybe you think, well, we're aiming too high. We're not like Moses, but I think we have to aim as high as we can to get to know God. And one of the ways to get to know God is to get to know his Tamuna. So that's what we're looking for. And we're trying to understand, what is this Tamuna thing? Okay, what is this Tamuna thing? In the second reading that we had by a person named Saltzman, that in that particular reading, what was stressed is being able to develop another dimension within yourself that looks at yourself. Okay, and this is sort of a preliminary thing to be able to, in fact, investigate the issue of Tamuna, because it turns out that Tamuna, the Tamuna of God, is not terribly different than the Tamuna of ourselves, okay? Given that the image, the Tamuna that we were created with in the Torah is the Tamuna that God used. And the Tamuna is the Tamuna of God. Okay. So those were the two things we've covered already. The third thing Phil is going to give us a first shot at. And the third thing has to do with poetry. The third thing has to do with a letter from a young man to a set of letters from a young man to Rilke, who was an intensely romantic, spiritual poet, German poet around 1910, 1920. And Rilke is stressing to him what it takes to, in his case, to become a poet. Now, why are we interested in poetry? We're interested in poetry, first of all, because as we read the Torah, many of the passages in the Torah, you could say, are poetic. So we have to be able to shape ourselves so that poetry becomes sort of a natural phenomena for us. It becomes a natural thing that we feel comfortable with. Okay, so poetry is a big deal. The other thing about poetry is, you might remember that in the old days, people talked about the trivium and the quadrivium. This was sort of medieval thought. The trivium is grammar, rhetorics, dialectic. And the trivium there should be four things to the trivium. It should be grammar, rhetorics, poetry, and dialectics. Poetry is a part of the mastery of language. Okay, if you're going to call yourself a master of language, you also have to be able not to write poetry, but you have to be able to feel poetry. You have to be able to understand poetry in the same way that you understand grammar, you understand rhetorics, people trying to convince you of this, that, and the other thing. You understand dialectics. Now, dialectics is much more complicated, and poetry. Dialectics and poetry are real key things for the tasks that we're going to be doing. Okay, Phil, you want to start with the reading?
Sorry.
Okay.
Am I on now? Can you hear me?
Yeah, you can hear you.
Good morning. I missed those classes. I'm very, very sorry. I wasn't even aware of them, I think. But so I'm going to start more naively, if I might, and then David, you can pull things together in a way that you like it. But I have not read the other letters. There are 10 letters that Rilke wrote to this young man. He was only 19 when this letter was written, but Rilke himself was only was not yet 30. But he writes like a man who has a lot more experience, and he is intensely romantic. I have not read the other letters. I have read some of his poems, but it may be that the letter would be better in context, and David may be able to fill something in on that. But let me just set out a couple of themes here that are going on in this letter, and it's much too long for us to sit and read through, it seems to me. Okay, and I don't know how long you want me to go on, but it can be 5, 6 minutes. It can be 10 minutes. Maybe 10 is too long.
Well, take your 10 minutes is fine, especially if you're going to say something that enlightens us. So go ahead.
Well, how high a bar that is, I'm not the one to say. But anyway, the letter has what seemed to me appear to be kinds of contradictions, but I think there are tensions on the surface, and that really he knows where he's headed in this letter. And I'm going to be reading a few sentences from almost each of the paragraphs of the letter, just a couple, so you could follow along if you have it. It starts on page 38 of this text from 1904. And really, he's still a very young man himself. He's talking to Mr. Kapus. He says, you have had many great sadnesses which have now passed by. Now, we don't know what those are. The letters of Kapus to Rilke were published actually in this century only. And they're available, I guess. I was trying to I haven't seen any of them. So I don't know what his sadnesses are, whether they're a breakup of a love affair or the death of a parent or I don't know, or an illness. But this is on such a level of generality, it probably doesn't matter. You have had many great sadnesses which have now passed by, and you say their passing was hard and upsetting for you. And then he tries to turn it to the positive. I ask you to consider whether these great unhappinesses did not rather pass through you. I did try to get a hold of the German text because this is very idiomatic sort of language, and I wanted to know what it said. And my German is at least good enough to try to figure that out, but I haven't found that. And he says, whether much within you has not changed, whether somewhere in some part of your being you were not transformed while you were unhappy. So he's looking for finding something transformational within himself, in his suffering, in his sadnesses. And he says a little farther down, if it were possible for us to see further than our knowledge reaches, and a little beyond the outworks of our intuition, going beyond our knowledge and even our intuitions of what we think might be true, perhaps we should then, back to his text, perhaps we should then bear our sadnesses with greater assurance than our joys. Would we really bear our sadnesses with greater assurance than our joys? I don't know. And I think this is a young romantic poet saying that, and maybe he was able to achieve that. Those of us who've had great sadness might see this in different ways. Now, he talks about being alone in the world. He seems to be saying here There are moments, he says, there are moments when something new enters into us, something unknown to us. So it seems like we're discovering something. It seems to be from outside, but it has to do with us and what is within us, finally. And he says in the next paragraph, because we are alone, and this is very important, this idea that we are in certain important ways solitary beings. We are alone with the strange thing that has entered into us because everything familiar and accustomed is taken away from us for a moment because we are in the middle of a transition. The sadness passes. What is new in us has entered our hearts and penetrated right into us, even into our blood. So something new, it seems, comes into us when we're so deeply saddened. And that is why, farther down in that paragraph, it is so important to be solitary and attentive when one is sad. He's telling them, be all alone and attend to what you're feeling and what you experience. And it sounds like being alone is very important, but we will see how this is turned on its head or maybe transformed in a little bit. He says, when the new penetrates us, the better we shall acquire it, the more it will be our fate. Now he's introducing the idea of fate, and where does this fate come from? Here he makes an interesting turn. He has some kind of a romantics idea of what we learned from Copernicus and from Galileo, because he talks about we have theories of planetary motion that have been changed. We used to think the Earth stood still and the sun went around it. Now we know that the sun is, relatively speaking, stationary, and the Earth, and therefore we are going round the sun. And in a way that he wants to analogize to that, although it's a very loose analogy, we come to recognize that what we call fate, which sounds like something imposed on us, something from above, maybe from a cosmic order, or something like that, originates in ourselves, in humankind. Here I would like to have the German text, but he's saying it's not just ourselves as individuals, but it's ourselves as humankind. So you mentioned the Tamuna, I had no plan at all to even refer to that. But if the Tamuna, or this figure of God, is like our own, that is very much like the Tselem, when God says, let us make man in our image. The word there is bitsalmanu. I think I have the vowel right, in our image. But here he's talking about fate originating in ourselves. It doesn't work on us from outside. So now we've gone from an idea that something has come into us, to the idea that it's really from within us. This understanding or this appreciation or whatever it is. And now, mind you, there's a program here. He wants to encourage this young poet. He has previously written to him, I gather from taking a look at quotations, this is, I think, the 8th of 10 letters that he's written to him. And I think it's in the first letter, Mr. Kapus has written to him to say, would you look at these poems I've written? Basically, I think he's asking, are they any good? Because he's poured his heart into them. And he refuses to give him an opinion on his poems at that point. He says it's very important for you to go ahead on your own way, and he doesn't want to interfere. And he won't give him, even on that level, any encouragement, which I thought was very striking, because he continues to write back and forth. And I can stop at any point if I'm saying something that's confusing, but otherwise I'll just go on a little bit if that's okay.
Yeah.
Feel free. I'm not looking.
No, yeah, listen, it's good. It's good. Keep going. Very good.
Right. Good or not, I have the paper in front of me. He says, so when we recognize that what we call fate originates in ourselves, in humankind, it does not work on us from the outside. Forgive me for having repeated that. But he says, because so many people did not absorb their fates while they were inhabited by them. I'd like to know what those words are, and did not make them a part of themselves. Only because of this did they fail to recognize what emerged from them. Somehow people are not taking account of what their fates really are. uh, and did not um, uh, really internalize them. I find this a little confusing. I'm sure this part is, to me, is very unclear, but I'm not faulting Rilke. And by the way, his poems are wonderful, and the, the German is just hard enough that if you have a dictionary and you know a little grammar, you can get through them, but then see how beautiful they are. He says, uh, they failed because they did not make them a part of themselves, that is, the fates. Because of this, did they fail to recognize what emerged from them? It was so foreign to them that in their confused panic, they assumed it must just have entered into them that is from the outside, for they swore never to have found anything of the sort in themselves before. People are very startled to find something that they must have come from the outside. Uh, but that actually it's within themselves. And then again, he plays with this Copernican idea. Because of the movement of the sun, people were deceived that the sun doesn't move. Uh, and he's, I think, maybe alluding to Galileo saying, really, the earth does move. So we are still deceived about the movement of what is to come. Um, uh, so how could things not be difficult for us? Now he comes back to solitude, and I want to touch on this before explaining how, or showing, I think, how he, or suggesting how he thinks that solitude is not finally the thing that we live in. He says, if we come back to solitude, it grows ever clearer that fundamentally it is not something one can take or leave. We are solitary. That's what we are. That on a certain level is our fate. And many of us may have had this feeling at one point or another. It can be very emotional to find yourself solitary. And he says, how much, and even to take it as our start, how much better, though, to see and accept that is what we are, that is solitary beings, and even to take it as our starting point. And if we do, it's a kind of giddiness. We no longer have a sure sense of things because we are all alone. And he compares it to someone who is taken out of his room, and he has this idea over and over of a room of one's own. Uh, Many people find themselves always having to share rooms, but he has this idea of you're in a room all alone, and suddenly you're ripped up and you're ripped off it, and you're taken off to a mountaintop. You're transported there, and how you feel you've lost your bearings. Um, and you would get a deep sense of insecurity. Now, at the bottom of that page 40, he says, in the same way, all distances, all measurements alter for the one who becomes solitary. Many such changes suddenly take place at once. And as with the man on the mountain top, unusual imaginings and curious sensations occur, which seem to take on dimensions greater than can be tolerated. It can be just too much to be solitary in this way. We must accept our existence in as wide a sense as can be. This idea that we must accept, because this is our fate, the solitary fate. This is what we have, and we must accept it and not fight against it and see what we can find within it. Now he goes on to talk about human beings being cowardly. They won't do this. He's sort of lecturing a tone here a bit, I think, on how you have to be courageous. As he, the romantic poet, maybe he's courageous, maybe he's not. I don't know. He died of leukemia at 51, I think, and I don't know how he handled the illness. But he then goes on to talk about experiences of apparitions, the spirit world, death, and even to talk about God, to say nothing of God. But I am going to say nothing of God myself here, because this can be a subject of discussion, but I'm going to pass that because it gets very complicated to talk about what that part is doing here. And I think I'd rather just go on to just bracket that. So he says to say nothing of God, and I will say nothing of God. And I'll leave that to David and those who know. He says, but the fear of the inexplicable has not just rendered the individual existence poorer. Now listen to this. Relations between people too have been restricted, lifted out of the riverbed of endless possibilities, which is a beautiful phrase, the riverbed of endless possibilities, this Heraclitus sort of image. And all of a sudden, so we find ourselves not solitary anymore, but vitally interested in the relations between people. Uh, um, even though he's told us that we are solitary and we live in solitude, and he doesn't try to draw fine distinctions there, but suddenly um, we find that we have a difficulty of having relations between people, but we need them. And here toward the bottom of the page, he says, only someone who is ready for anything and rules nothing out. That's a beautiful romantic image there. Everybody's ready for anything and rules nothing out. Not even the most enigmatic things will experience the relationship with another. That's another human being, I assume he's talking about, at least in the first instance, as a
How does
living
that
thing.
work? What's your speculation about how that turn occurs from
Okay,
being, yeah,
no, go on. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no,
I,
no, what's your speculation as to
I think
how?
I want to finish that sentence first, though, because what he says is we will experience the relationship with another as a living thing. The relationship with another person uh, um, can be itself and must be a living thing itself. Suddenly, so we have gone from our solitary selves, we look in ourselves, we find resources there, and we are now more able to relate to other people in some way. I hope I'm trying to address your point. Um,
Mhm.
and and it turns out that the relationship with others is absolutely vital. And the relationship with another, now maybe it's God or maybe it's another more, in the first instance, certainly a human being, and I don't know what his beliefs were, uh, is as a living thing. We've gone from the solitary being that we are at bottom I shouldn't say suddenly, to a picture of ourselves as not only having necessary relations with other people if we are to be, I wouldn't just say fulfilled, but just to have meaning in life, uh, uh, but to but have a relationship with another person, which is itself, uh, he calls it a living being. Um, for imagining an individual's existence as as a larger or smaller room, we're back to that nice bourgeois room, reveals to us that most people are only acquainted with one corner of their particular room, one little area to pace up and down in. Uh, and on the next page. That way, they have a certain security. Now, I'm not going into the rest of this paragraph now, but it's certainly worth talking about because he compares our situation uh, or of that ordinary person, say, to the prisoner in Poe's tales, who are just trying to find their way around in their horrible dungeons. We are not prisoners. There are no traps or snares set around us, and there is nothing that should frighten or torment us. Here in the middle of page 41, we are placed into life as into the element with which we have the most affinity. Um, and moreover, we have come after thousands of years of adaptation to resemble this life so closely that we can still hardly be distinguished from all that surrounds us. This is very dense, but we are part of the world very much just as we are also, however, solitary. And he goes on to say we have no reason, again, the romantic, we have no reason to be mistrustful of our world, for it is not against us. Many people will find that surprising, uh, but but it's vital to him and his pursuit to say the world is not against us. Uh, we can discuss uh, how we feel about that. And so he says to Mr. Campos, you should not be dismayed if a sadness rises up in front of you greater than any you have ever seen before. You must think that something is happening with you, that life has not forgotten you, that it holds you in its hand, that it will not let you fall. He holds you in his hand. He's got the whole world in his hand. It won't let you fall. Well, of course, it might let you fall. People fall all the time. And then he talks about depression of spirit, but he doesn't really resolve that question. And he says, if there is something ailing in the way you go about things, now he's putting the responsibility on on his correspondent and his correspondent as a creator in a way. If there is something ailing in the way you go about things, remember that sickness is the means by which an organism rids itself of something foreign to it. That is actually bears a certain resemblance to I think it's William James who called it the religion of healthy mindedness, be found in Mary Baker Eddy and the Christian Science, that you get ill because you need to purge your body and you'll be better off afterwards. There's a certain view of that. But I take it here, it's a statement of it's an aspiration, really. You must be patient as an invalid and trusting as a convalescent. And turns out also, you are your own doctor to look after yourself. For your doctor can do nothing but wait sometimes, and that's because you are, after all, your own doctor. Or as my own cardiologist told me just the other day, when I detailed some of my memory problems, he said it's not going to get any better.
She thinks.
That's free. That's free advice because I pay a lot
Advice.
for that. And so I think I would just add one more point here. I'm sorry to have gone on so long.
No, you're fine, you're fine.
Very dense.
I could not make any sense of this, Phil, before you started explaining. Go ahead.
Well, you may make a totally different sense of it, which is fine with me because I'm talking about it. He says simple. So do not do not draw over rapid conclusions from what is happening to you. Do not watch yourself too closely. Simply let it happen. Now he says you have to have a certain trust in your own future possibilities. Otherwise, you will soon too readily find yourself looking on your past, which is, of course, not uninvolved with everything that is going on in you now, reproachfully. You'll look at your past reproachfully. That is, moralistically. But don't do that. Don't judge. The extraordinary circumstances of a solitary and helpless childhood are so difficult. So maybe he is touching on Mr. Kapus's experience. And that so complicated, exposed to so many influences, that is the circumstances of the solitary childhood, and at the same time removed from any real life context, that if a vice enters into it, we must not be too quick to call it a vice. I think they both went to the same military academy, and as you might not be surprised to learn, Rainer Maria Rilke was not well suited to the military life and did not stay there, did not make a career out of it there. We should, in general, be very careful with names. It is so often the name of a crime which destroys a life. The name of a crime which destroys a life. I find it very interesting, but again, I would leave that for discussion. And the expenditure of energy only seems so great because you put too much importance on the victory. Somehow you have to win. He says, but it is not victory that is the great thing you think you have achieved. Though the feeling is not an error, what is great is that there is already something there that you were able to set in place of that deception, something real and true. Without it, your victory would only have been a moral reaction with no further significance. But as it has become a segment of your life, it has become a segment of your life, your little victory. It's just one little cut off piece. Of your life, I am thinking which I am thinking of with so many hopes and wishes. Do you remember how this life of yours longed in childhood to belong to the grown-ups? I can see that it now longs to move on from them and is drawn to those who are greater yet. So there's possibilities in the future for you, Mr. Kapus. And I don't know, at some point he does encourage him. In fact, one of his poems later, one of his last letters, he writes back to Mr. Kapus, writing a sonnet in his own hand that was nothing but recopying what Kapus wrote, so that he will see that Kapus will see that Rilke appreciates his poetry. I will leave it there. Thank you.
That's great, Phil.
Yeah,
That's
thank
great.
you,
I think
Phil.
that was a really, really nice review, and it highlighted a couple of the features that I think we should focus on. One of them is his Rilke's ability to look at himself. And he's telling Coppice too that you have to be a little bit outside of yourself to be able to feel these things without much fear. And he's counseling Coppice that whatever feelings, and we can discuss what we think feelings are, but whatever feelings are, that you have are something internal to you. There's something that, and there's the beginning part is whether things come from the outside or come from the inside. And there's a sort of a blur as to whether experiences come from the outside or come from the inside, or come from the outside but are really from the inside. So, but in order to even make those kinds of distinctions and be comfortable with feeling strange things, listen, poets like Rilke get in touch with, I would say, you can call it the spirit work. Okay, they're not completely bound to their sensations. They're feeling things which, under many circumstances, would drive the average person a little bit crazy, because the average person would then try and map it out to some thing that's really happening to them, and they couldn't map it out. These are things that are almost inexplicable. And so Rilke is counseling this guy that if you feel things that are inexplicable, examine them a bit. Don't get upset about them. Let them flow through you. Flow through you is a big deal. Is that you don't have to grab onto them. You don't have to dwell in them. You don't have to get fearful of them. They flow through you in a naturalistic way, because you're part of the universe. Okay, so what he's saying here is that human beings are part of a universe that is often experienced as hitting you from the outside, but it may be things that are coming at you from the inside. And can you tell the difference between things that are coming at you from the inside and things that are coming at you from the outside? Anyway, what do other people feel about some of these issues?
May I add a brief coda here?
Sure.
I'm just happened to be reading Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe's solitary figure deals with the exact same theme we're talking here. Deals with it a lot more clearly, a lot more concisely, comes to pretty much the same conclusion. Great sadness leading to liberation of the spirit, leading to enhanced empathy. It makes this look almost like a Woody Allen dialogue.
Really? Okay.
Or monologue. But the bottom line is, no, this is deep and this is worth examining, but it's also good to see it in very clear and basic terms. Same idea.
Mm-hmm.
This is not original. It's all I'm
No, none of it's original.
No.
Murray and I are reading Martin Buber's I and Thou
God,
together,
yes.
and this is very, very much like that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that there's something that we're in touch with that seems to us to be different from us, but yet it doesn't seem to be different from us. And if you can take the right attitude towards it, it doesn't become totally surprising to you. Okay.
Yeah, and Buber's experience, as I recall, was based on his own personal experience in the Holocaust. Isn't that?
Not necessarily the Holocaust. No. Buber is the same sort of character as Rilke. I mean, these guys were into deep thoughtfulness, introspection. And as they introspect, the motivation to introspect might be different in both of them, but as they introspect, they find very similar things. And they end up being more empathic in the whole process to other people, because somehow they find out that they're not so different from other people.
Exactly.
And that's an experience that you end up having.
So that's in common with this, because again, with Robinson Crusoe, the two animating ideas at the end, liberation of the spirit, and the idea of enhanced empathy, which is what you're talking about. Yeah, more empathic, right? Yeah. Okay, sorry, just to tie it.
No, not sorry. No. Anybody else have some notions about this?
When I read this, I tried personalizing
Mm-hmm.
to
By the way, that's the only way to.
right.
Yeah.
I mean, to something I'm going through, okay? And it was very helpful, because so you feel sad, so don't try to make it go away. That's what I've always tried to do. Okay, I'm gonna go, run around the block 50 times so I don't have to feel sad. But let it happen.
Sure.
You can relate to it a whole lot better.
What happens though if you feel something that doesn't have a name to it? Okay, now sadness is one of the emotions inside
Okay,
us that we
right.
give a name to. Happiness is one of them, spiritedness maybe is another. What
Okay.
happens if you feel something that doesn't
just
have,
doesn't have a
that
name?
is nameless?
Oh,
Can you handle
does it
that?
have to have a name?
No, it
No.
doesn't. No, it doesn't.
No.
Can you handle that?
I think the same way.
Yeah,
But feelings don't have a name.
feelings are given names,
Right.
but they certainly don't have to have names.
You can just say it's a feeling.
It's emotion.
It's an emotion,
It's some
yeah.
sort of motion inside of me. A feeling is like an emotion is emotion. So
Right.
something puts
It's
us in
happening.
motion. Yeah, now if you listen to music, you're going to get a huge blast of motion inside of you, right? And unless you're a musician and get into the analysis of the music, you're not going to understand per se what this is, but you're going to trust it. Okay, if it's a symphony by Beethoven and you're listening to it, you're probably going to trust it, no matter which way it moves you. You're not going to get too scared, right?
But this music thing is what helps kids who are on the spectrum, who have been unable to talk or express feelings or something. And there was one great thing once I saw in our program on how this kid, just listening to the music and then learning how to play the piano, enabled him to express what he was feeling. It was like, I mean, that's the kind of thing you're talking
Sure.
about. It happens, let it be.
Now,
I would like to say something
Sure, go ahead.
in reference to the reading. I have a disability, a brain disorder, and it's a psychiatric disability, and I've been healing from this for 30 years. Well, until about 3 years ago, I might call my family up with my existential angst. I'm like, oh, this is happening, I am miserable and I am hurt. But 3 years ago, I decided I would just tell myself, I'm going to get into this. Whatever this is, I'm experiencing or feeling, I'll just sit in my front room. I'm going to just get into it. And sometimes I'll call one of my family members, my sister or my mother or my brother, whomever, and I'll say, I am not feeling well. I'm having, some feelings that are very uncomfortable and sad in terms of depression. So I'm just going to get into this. And then also I thought about when I came up with saying existential angst, because when I was a teenager, about 17, I read John Paul Sartre's, I think it was called, the name was Satire, because I'm reading it on my own. I'm not in school learning how to say his name. So I said Satire. So he had the book Existentialism. So I read that and I thought, oh, okay, well, the world's misery. Life is miserable. Okay, I can move on because I was miserable. I got the philosophy. But when we were reading Rilke just now, I thought, wow, perhaps later or even then, that would have been a good philosophy to read. But I went on to be a very happy person and just continue to do the things I enjoyed, which I was doing at that time, but there was this cloud over my head all the time. But I really love what Wilkie's saying.
So you sort of got over the angst by somehow changing your attitude towards it. It wasn't something that you hated. It wasn't something that you had to push away. You let it flow through you.
Yes, exactly.
You let it flow through you. You realized in the angst that it's not such a big deal at all to feel this particular feeling. In fact, any feeling that we have, any kind of emotion inside of us, is still what it is. It's something that's indescribable that we humans have in all circumstances.
you're a good therapist. You know, I'm starting with a new therapist today, a male therapist for the first time in 30 years. And I'm going to see what happens. But I see this is a
Well,
good
do you know, I
segue
used to,
to that.
in the old days, I used to be a psychiatrist, but anyway, so I know something about this. Anybody else have some comments? Nancy, what do you think about this? Diane?
Yeah, I just want to, I like this passage. So first of all, Phil, thank you so much. And thank you, David. So what I wanted to share is that for me, what I'm getting out of this is there was a period of time in my life about 20 years ago when I went into great suffering, and the details are not important, but basically it went on for several years, 6 or 7 years, and it probably tapped into my greatest fears, my greatest insecurities during that period of time, and it was really very difficult. And I have still, and I had at the time, a very wonderful cadre of friends who are extremely supportive, extremely caring, extremely loving. But the truth of the matter is you are alone in that suffering because they can't remove that suffering for you. They can be there and they can love you and they can support you and they can do all sorts of things for you, but they cannot remove that suffering. And from a spiritual perspective, I had grown up, in an environment believing in God. But during that period of time, I was one of those people who suffer a great period of, you have such a great period of suffering, it eventually becomes anger at God and saying, how could you do this to me? How could you make this happen to me? And again, all the details are unimportant, but I almost said God doesn't exist. And I have a couple atheistic friends who were like, yay, she's going to become an atheist. But during that period of time, I did converse with a lot of different people, my friends, and, friends referred me to spiritual people to talk to. And, some people couldn't deal with my anger. But there was one minister in particular who, it was really weird. He didn't have any answers for me. I was looking for answers. And his one thing that he said to me is, it's a matter of faith. And so I took that, and out of that suffering and taking that term, my faith in God actually became more firm and more stronger than ever. I don't think it will ever go away again. And so I guess kind of out of what I'm trying to say out of that experience is a lot of what's in this book mirrors what I experienced, the solitude in your room, the connection with people outside. And I also feel that period of suffering did two things. It made me a better person. It made me more aware of what's happening with other people around me. And it made me more capable of relating to other people and understanding where they are coming from and feeling for them and comforting them. That's my 2 cents.
Very good.
I have a question, based on your exposition, raised and having deep thinkers here. Sharing your thoughts on a much more superficial level in terms of, and this is not suffering by the definitions we're talking about, but sadness or what have you, a challenge, for lack of better words. Post-heart transplant, I had been in Northwestern under the thrall of a number of specialists that said, oh no, you need, as an example, you need an ablation, you need this, you need that. And I was sort of wondering, okay, how many surgical procedures are you going to do on me before I die? Fortunately, I was guided by wise hands towards transplant technology. And one of the things that my cardiologist, Dr. Yancey, did, thank God, was say, no, you can start walking now, thank God. But I was totally disabilitated at that point. So ultimately, I ended up at Shirley Ryan inpatient and sort of saying to myself, woe unto me, I can't walk. I was literally totally disabilitated. And the strange thing was, talking about feeling sad and alone and so forth, was when I saw, like, they had people that they had brought from Bethesda wounded veterans, disabled and so forth, walking. I sort of said to myself, I have no problems. What am I complaining about? And so I'm asking myself, is that an intrinsically selfish feeling to have to sort of improve yourself by seeing somebody that you perceive is in a more challenging situation than you?
I don't know if it's selfish. I think what happens is somehow the boundaries between ourselves and others, we're taught to have boundaries between ourselves and others. So that, for example, if I look at my wife, she seems to me to be other than me. I go up and I touch her, she's occupying a different space than me. But in some strange sense, we're occupying the same space. We're not so different. In fact, there may be in a certain sense that's exterior to our sensations. There may be a way in which we're one thing. Okay, we're
So
one
are you
thing.
saying that boundaries is more of a perceptual?
Yeah, boundaries are perceptual and they're taught. And in our culture, we're taught to have very strict boundaries. And for example, in Japanese culture, the boundaries are different. The boundaries when you're talking to a person, how close you can get, how far you can get when you're talking to somebody. Somehow in some societies are very different. But anyway, boundaries have to become, if we're going to be able to get this properly, our boundaries have to become more fluid.
Yeah.
Okay. They have to, yes, and you have to allow that to happen to you. Like, for example, as people were talking about the suffering, is the suffering because of the divinity that's into us who's suffering or who's made us suffer? We locate suffering, we locate our feelings within our body, and we have certain kind of pre-examined conceptions as to how we allocate these feelings. I would get rid of all of that. Okay. So what you try and do is you try and think about things from a completely fresh perspective. You're going to deconstruct everything that's been taught to you. I'll tell you a story. When I started studying stuff like this about 50 years ago, there was an old Jewish guy who I went to his bookstore, and he was on Dearborn Street. His name was Ben Fine. Anyway, he was a squirrely guy. And I came in there and I said, I want all the books on Kabbalah that you got, because I want to take a look at that. He said, no, you can't do that. You got to read this first and this first. And he had me reading good books first. But he told me that the real key to this is that you have to destroy the tables and chairs you sat at in Cheder. These were his exact words. You have to destroy the tables and chairs you sat at in Cheder. So I said, how do you do that? I thought to myself, well, because I was always a good student and I would take people's advice, at least in the beginning, what I did is I relearned the multiplication table. That seemed to me to be a table. I could relearn that. So 4 times 3 is 1, 4 times 3 is 16. I just completely trashed all of the structure that was inside of me with respect to multiplication. Now, unfortunately, it came back. And so I can make change and I can do things like that. I'm not devoid of that particular skill, but it's useful. It's useful to take things that you think you know about yourself and begin to unknow them, begin to be puzzled by them again, begin to be puzzled as to everything that you're experiencing and feeling. And why you want to be puzzled by it is you want to get out of the routine ways of thinking about the world and yourself and your relationship with it. And all of this because of the poet, and this is the study of being a poet, like Rilke is.
Yeah.
Not a psychological poet, not a modern poet, but I would say Rilke is one of the most powerful poets I've ever read, and I've read lots and lots of poetry. So what you try and do is you try and sort of devoid yourself of the usual forms of responding to stuff, to open yourself up to open yourself up, and maybe then we get to understand this thing called the tamuna.
So what you're saying is, if I'm understanding you correctly, part of what you're saying is sort of, part of that sort of getting to that place, in a manner of speaking, you have to unlearn, literally unlearn. A classic example is, Mark Twain, Huckleberry Finn, where Huckleberry Finn has to unlearn the fact that slavery is acceptable. That's what he was taught and so forth, and through his youngish experience, he unlearns that in order to become a better person.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And any sort of things that are given, Now, you can't take this too far.
Yeah.
So if you're in a store and you're buying stuff or you're with your friends, you have to be able to balance yourself off properly.
Yeah.
So in private, you're doing a lot of this deconstruction. But in public, you look like you're about the same person. You look like, you're not in outer space. That's a very important thing. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think what this makes me think of is my parents were both Holocaust survivors. So I remember growing up when I was in high school, and I remember being on the L of a bus or something like that, and I would feel very, I don't know, I felt angry. I felt like if I saw someone, I felt like you might have to fight that person. Didn't know why, because I wasn't angry at them, but I had these feelings, and it wasn't until much later, till I ended up going to therapy, that I found out that really a lot of this was from my parents' trauma and things that they never talked about, but it was just inherited trauma, So it wasn't until I kind of came to terms with that, that I understood what was going on and realized, well, it's not mine, it's
Somebody else's, yeah.
Right. And I think that's something, when you talk about unlearning something, it's not like I was born and I wanted to learn about this, it's like I grew up, with my parents immigrated to this country in 1949. I was 2.5. And, then, you kind of get in here. You learn what people are trying to teach you, but there's a lot of things that you learn just by osmosis because you're in the situation.
Yeah, and those are the most difficult things to rid yourself of, because you don't know that you have them. Okay, you don't know what your secret attitudes are. You don't know what your inner take on things, your unexamined take on things. Right. So the examination, in the beginning, the examination of oneself psychologically is very important. After a while, the examination of oneself psychologically disappears. Okay, that's not important. The examination becomes much different than psychological. So who your mommy was, who your daddy was, who their history was, is not very interesting to you. After you've mastered the psychological stuff,
Yes.
Then you get into something that's much more ineffable, much more difficult to even speak about. And that's where we're headed for those who want to make the trip, okay? Yeah. But this particular reading, the way Phil expressed it, it was really, really very nice, because what he's showing us is he's showing us the advice of a guy who's close to the end. Okay, he's close to being there with this trip. And this guy is telling you what he did to be able to get there. And the most important things he did was he had courage. Courage is a huge virtue, by the way. Courage is one of the philosophic virtues. Philosophers didn't have a lot of virtues, but they certainly had courage as a virtue. Courage is a virtue. And he's talking about solitude. Solitude is a very important thing to be able to develop these unlearning things.
But then you have to move on. When he's talking about a room,
He's not talking about a physical room. He's talking about you are the room.
Right,
And you
himself.
are in a small room. And you will remain in that small room unless you learn how to expand that room. And that means letting others in.
Well, but it
Mr.
means
Glass.
others in, it means also letting
Letting
everything. You gotta let the storms that come by in the night in. You gotta let the lightning and the thunder and all of these things and make them part of you.
Yeah, I think his
Mr.
example
Glass.
is good, you know, your
Oh.
example, great.
Yeah,
Yeah,
because, I mean,
yeah,
even though
that's
your
good.
parents
Right.
didn't talk about.
But it was in the environment.
you must have felt their sadness.
Right,
And I would argue that precisely because they didn't talk about it.
that's
it
right.
Enhanced it.
Yeah.
I mean, you could have spent your whole life being angry. And you're the
Yeah.
least angry person I know.
And he's become a sweetie.
That he is.
Mr. Glass, before we log off, I just had a brief announcement. I'm going to the to see the Chicago Symphony Orchestra in the afternoon on June 21st, and I wanted one of you to go with me. I already paid for the ticket. You don't have to pay for the ticket. And I just want to know who wants to go out and to see Tchaikovsky, and it's going to be at 1:30 p.m. Friday, June 21st, 2024. We're going to be on the main floor. That's where I've been sitting since a couple years ago because I started playing violin. I want to see the violinist, and so I thought, well, sit in main row, come out of the balcony, and get some free lessons. But so who can go
That's
to
very
this?
nice.
I already
That's
paid.
very nice
Pardon
of you.
me?
I would love to, but we're in California.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
anybody else?
Yeah.
Okay, well,
I'll take that ticket.
I'll
Okay.
consider it.
Okay, and
I'll
okay,
consider it, but I have to check my calendar.
Oh, here you
Or
go,
take
two
Nancy.
volunteers.
you got two
Okay,
volunteers.
Nancy.
I'll take that
Nancy.
ticket. My
Nancy.
calendar is
And
free.
Nancy, yes,
nice,
send
Nancy.
him your email.
Sure, I'm gonna put it in the chat, Yvette.
Okay, listen,
Thank
next
you.
week we're not going to meet because it's Shavua, but we will meet the week after and the following weeks, okay?
Is the next time we
It
meet
is
that
next
short
week,
poem?
right, Phil, or is next week we are
I
meeting?
think you make the 13th is the second day of Shavuot. Next week.
Okay, so next week we are meeting,
And
next
not the
week we
week
are
after.
meeting, and not the week after, I'm sorry about that. And if anybody wants to do the one next week, there's gonna be 2 readings next week. And the readings are gonna continue to the week after. We're gonna be doing the passage in the Torah where Moses experiences the burning bush. Okay, that particular very famous passage in the Torah where Moses experiences the burning bush. So we're going to be doing that, and we're also going to be doing the notion of the nameless in the Tao Te Ching, the first small poem. It's about 10 lines long.
Right.
So if anybody wants to do that, you got my email, and give me a blast, and maybe we'll have 2 speakers. But the burning bush thing, we're going to keep on. We're going to do that next week and the following 2 weeks later. From
Well,
that.
is that, because the only thing that came was that little 10-line poem.
That's it. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, but that's,
The other-
yeah,
the
but we're
other
gonna
one is just
combine,
voted
we're gonna
up.
combine that because we missed last week. So I
Okay.
gotta combine these 2 because I do think that 10-line poem is absolutely worth, it's a real gem.
Cool.
And
Yes.
if we can get to the bottom of that,
Ah.
I think we'll be well along our way. Anyway, so.
Hey, I just want to, I don't know how the emails are supposed to come out, whether they come from you, David, or not. But I just want to make sure I'm on the list because I'm not getting the literature, although I did get the cancellation for the 23rd. So I don't know what's going on with the emails.
Do you know what?
Sending them out, I just want to make
Okay.
sure I'm on it.
Call the
If
office, I would say.
Yeah,
They're
call
very.
the
Okay,
office.
send, you got my email, right? Do you have my email?
I do. So,
Okay, it's
well, I mean, because I got your thing on the 23rd.
okay,
so I can
D
send it there.
Klass, no, but my personal email is DKLASS David Klass, dklass@gmail.com. Send me a note and I'll send you all the readings. I'm debating as to put out all the readings within the next few days. I think they're very interesting, and you'll be able to see what the scope of the stuff that we're looking at is in this class.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
Mr.
Very good.
Glass,
And lots of it is seriously strange stuff. okay?
Yeah.
Seriously strange
home
stuff.
strange
So,
stuff.
which should excite some of you and maybe scare some of you away. So we'll see. Anyway, send me.
I will. Yeah.
Okay, good.
okay,
All right.
Mr. Glass,
Good job,
is it
Phil.
Mr. Glass, is it appropriate? I just want to give you all my number in case you find out about any interesting art exhibits. And Nancy, if you all could just write it down. I can't type it in. It's
Listen.
773
773
458
458
8312.
8312. I'm
And
texting
that,
now.
okay, and so everybody, you can have that number. If a lecture's going on, something interesting, art show, just call me at 773 458 8312. And I live in Oak
Okay.
Park, Illinois.
Okay, great. Okay, listen, thank you all for your participation, and
Thank
we'll
you.
see you next week.
Thank
All
you,
right.
Phil.
Okay,
Thank you
thanks
very
so
Thank you,
much.
Phil. Yeah,
Great
that was
job.
great, Phil.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks for the
Phil.
great reading,
job,
Phil.
Phil.
David.
Thank you, Mr.
Bye.
Glass.
Next.
Nice to
Okay.
meet you, Yvette.
Thank you all. Yvette.